LEGO Harry Potter, years 1 through 4, fair enough I suppose, 8 would be kind of a lot, more or less proves the conclusions I drew in the LEGO Indy 2 video. That game was a prototype for what was to come. LEGO Harry Potter builds on that rocky foundation pretty well. The several small hub worlds have been condensed into one large, elaborate, puzzle and challenge-filled Hogwarts overworld, which serves as both a hub world and its own open-world exploration game. Although it's balanced with 6 tightly designed levels per movie, which, while more puzzle-focused than prior games, are generally in line with the style and quality of the games from the first era. LEGO Harry Potter years 1 through 4 firmly carries the series into its second era, adapting the first 4 books, or more so their movie adaptations. The Sorcerer's Stone, I'm not British, The Chamber of Secrets, The Prisoner of Azkaban, and The Goblet of Fire. And is released on way more than the second Indy had, and that already had quite a few. Initially released on PC, PS3, Xbox 360, and Wii, with PSP and DS conversions, but also relatively recently being re-released in the LEGO Harry Potter collection alongside its sequel for Switch, PS4, and Xbox One. LEGO Harry Potter pretty foundationally fixes most of LEGO Indy 2's issues. Hogwarts is a fully fleshed out open world hub. It's large, complicated, and frankly pretty confusing to navigate. However, very nearly every room has several puzzles associated with it, all of which tie into the game's numerous collectibles. Gold bricks, which serve as a general benchmark for completion and are awarded for most tasks, like True Jedi or finding 4 house crests in a level, basically the new version of mini-kits, but also sometimes get awarded in Hogwarts at seemingly random. Character tokens are a great new addition that make new characters purchasable by completing puzzles, and appear in the overworld and within levels. Red bricks are extras and are solely found in the overworld, as are students in peril, students in dangerous situations that can be rescued for even more gold bricks. All this and the relatively puzzle-focused nature of this game makes it rather fun to wander Hogwarts' maze-like halls, picking up new stuff at every turn. Despite how complex Hogwarts is, the game pretty blatantly makes sure you aren't lost during the story, as ghosts will leave trails of uncollectible studs leading you by the hand from story event to story event, which makes the game very pleasant when you just want to move along. I will say, the game's new system for handling characters does mean exploring too much before the story ends isn't all that powerful. There's a few useful extras and multipliers that can be grabbed about halfway through, but because spells are unlocked gradually throughout the story, it's rare that you can go completely nuts. On the more general gameplay, it actually ends up being a lot more unique than you might expect. As opposed to a rotating cast of characters, each having 1 or 2 unique traits that define them, the player spends most of the game as Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who learn spells periodically between main levels, which opens up more and more possibilities, almost like an extremely light Metroidvania. The player starts with only the simple attack spell, and slowly works up their arsenal. Wingardium Leviosa works like the Force in the Star Wars games did, assemble things with it, move them around, and even a somewhat janky freeform movement puzzle in some spots that always feels kinda bad thanks to the stackable objects having physics and really liking to stick to each other. Lumos lights up dark areas and scares off evil vines. Immobilis can be used to kill pixies that sometimes hold puzzle items. Ridiculous is used to get rid of boggarts that occasionally block doors and paths. Expecto Patronum kills Dementors, which start appearing in the 3rd movie, and Reducto blows up silver objects. All of these are both used throughout the levels and in finding Hogwarts' many collectibles. You also notice many of these are less tied to combat than they are to puzzles. It makes sense. The first 2 movies are basically slice of life stories with a little bit of action in their climaxes, while even the more actiony latter 2 feature ghosts in the back half of the 3rd and a mostly friendly wizard competition in the 4th. The game in general focuses much heavier on light puzzle and environmental interaction than combat or platforming, which is, I think, a nice change of pace that sets this game apart, even if I do miss when these games were more platformer than anything else. Various characters also have traits or signature abilities, so the whole roster isn't completely one note. Harry, for example, has the invisibility cloak that's used like twice and can use Parcel Tongue to get through snake doors. Hermione and other smart characters can open cabinets with runes on them. Ron and Hermione, plus a few others, have summonable pets or can transfigure into animals that can dig up buried objects or crawl through small tubes. Student characters can only enter the dormitories of their own house, but certain teachers are able to bypass this. Adults can go past age barriers that block certain restricted sections. Large guys like Crumb and Hagrid can pull heavy levers. Hermione can use the time turner in a few select spots to access unique areas in the past. Griphook, the bank goblin, has a key that can open safes, and pretty much every villain can use dark magic to activate red objects like the Dark Force users could in LEGO Star Wars. So the cast is pretty varied and strong in general. This is also supplemented with potions during exploration or in levels. In the open world, and in probably 90% of levels in this game, only the main 3 cast members are present. Assembling potions by finding ingredients hidden in nearby areas can lead to temporarily gaining strength, invisibility, or in the case of the Polyjuice potion, turning into any character, which in the overworld is sort of used as a character select and incorporates cleverly into puzzles, where accessing the potion is as much of a puzzle as the other elements. In the same vein, many of the game's levels take advantage of similar mechanics. Not all of them, some of them are just cool set pieces, especially in Goblet of Fire, but often these same elements that make the overworld so fun to move about in are used in basically the same ways, but more compactly and slightly more challengingly in the main levels of the game. While it's not the most action-y set piecey or exciting LEGO game, I really appreciate what LEGO Harry Potter is going for with its more relaxed puzzle box approach. It really stands out from the more action-oriented Star Wars and Indiana Jones games that preceded it and makes it all the stronger. The biggest flaw in the game is the general bugginess. We're still in a bit of a growing pain arc here. To recount some that happened to me personally, at a certain point in the game stopped tracking my spawn point into Hogwarts properly. Instead of respawning me in the room I was last in, it always sent me to the Owlery, which is perhaps the most inconvenient room in the game. In the last hour of our playtime, the UI vanished and never came back, and most egregiously, the secret basement area of the Charms classroom decided it just wasn't going to open anymore, with our last collectible locked down in the basement. I genuinely believed we got soft locked at 98.8%, but thankfully the extremely helpful people at the LEGO Harry Potter speedrunning Discord informed me that in any room in the game you can simply turn yourself into a frog, get into the corner, and when you return to full size, clip into any wall and jump out of bounds, which allowed me to rescue the last brat, and that is just what hit us in our casual playthrough. Never mind a variety of other soft locks I've seen reported when I was researching that issue and a bunch of other minor issues. The game feels a little wonk, and we played on the LEGO Harry Potter Collection updated release, which allegedly fixed some bugs as well, so keep that in mind. In regards to its presentation, the strongest thing LEGO Harry Potter has going for it is Hogwarts itself. The character models have basically plateaued at this point, given the LEGO style. There's a bit of a cap on how far Fidelity can take these characters, and animations likewise have basically hit a wall. They're very smoothly animated, and certain characters have some nice unique touches. There's also neat little transformation animations for some of the potion effects, like the strength one. And it's all very nice, but it really hasn't improved since the last game. Levels themselves also tend to be nice. Harry Potter may not have the most exciting locations or set pieces, since most of it takes place in the same area. It's a little more low-key until the 4th movie, which does have some pretty nice set pieces itself though, especially the large-scale dragon level. But many of the levels actually use chunks of the overworld, given, they take place in Hogwarts. That Hogwarts is good enough to be incorporated into story missions says a lot. The whole castle is extremely detailed and features pretty well every major location from the movies, and interconnected in a logical way that makes it feel like one large, continuous, if a little bit disorienting whole. Once you come to grips with how many rooms there are, it becomes relatively easy to find where you need to be. The dormitories are on the top floor, so you keep moving up. The dungeon is on the bottom, so you keep moving down. Hogwarts is also stuffed to the brim with movement. Students and staff wander every area, moving paintings line the wall and offer little sight gags, and every area has its own unique flair. The greenhouses are overgrown with odd plants, the defense against the dark arts rooms are dimly lit and have all sorts of little bones and creatures hanging around, and the clock tower has giant gears spinning every which way. If Hogwarts wasn't so immaculately designed, this game would be significantly worse, as it really does carry this game in both gameplay and visuals. As for the music, like most other games, it uses the soundtrack from the movies. The earlier movies, especially the first two, had really charming and soft pieces, and the title theme is especially strong, although I'd say I largely didn't notice the music in this game. It's music orchestration for music, and while generally pleasant, doesn't stand out as it's typically not meant to. Each movie is structured into the fairly typical 6 levels per movie that the LEGO games typically use. It honestly might be a little bit much for the oldest movies, primarily because they're so set-piece light and therefore feel a bit more stretched thin. Between every level is some kind of Hogwarts segment, ranging from simply traveling to the next to, especially in years 1 and 2, attending classes to learn and tutorialize new spells. The levels do a fairly good job at capturing the plot of the movie despite being in the classic style. This game might actually be played a bit more straight than others, with far less gags and cutscenes, although they are still present. The Sorcerer's Stone feels the most padded, although they do an okay job of making it work. The opening in Diagon Alley is a rather clever tutorial, starting off basic but giving Harry his wand, introducing the spell wheel, making potions. It still works as a level, but hits the basics of everything this relatively complex game has going on, and the game doesn't exactly skip on the early slice of life stuff either that makes up the first half of the movie. It's just condensed into the Hogwarts intermissions, which is actually a decent solution all things considered. The next actual level skips to about the midway point with the troll in the bathroom, which is kind of a lot, but it's one of the shorter levels in the game too, consisting of a short hallway and some puzzles and a boss fight that's more or less force a thrown object back at the guy. Something very common in the Star Wars games at least, and also pretty common in these ones too. One aspect of the movies that this game skips out on pretty thoroughly is Quidditch, which is a little bit weird. Although it's hard to blame them, outside of being briefly important in the first film, it's largely irrelevant to the series as a whole, plus it's kinda just a badly designed game given there's 8 million things going on and only getting the snitch is relevant. That little sidetrack is all to say that the Quidditch level here, the scene where Hermione and Ron think Snape is jinxing Harry's broom, mostly ignores its existence, instead focusing on Ron and Hermione in the bleachers with a few cool set-piece moments where players crash into the stands and such. It's a fine enough premise for the level. It ends up being a little bit generic in the end though. The restricted section is where things feel the most stretched, making a potion, dodging the groundskeeper with the invisibility cloak, being so dead set on hitting 6 levels is what ends up making these more generic ones like this. Same for the Forbidden Forest. Fang the dog is used to dig stuff up, Hagrid can shoot stuff with a crossbow, but it's mostly just a very straightforward little level. The final level kinda mixes it up, condensing all the trials to get to the Sorcerer's Stone into one long set-piece fest, from getting past the 3-headed dog, to chasing down the flying keys on a broom, to building and manipulating the chess pieces to fight each other before taking on Quirrell. He's one of those fights where you just Leviosa a projectile back at him 3 times and he dies, which is fine enough for a first real boss, but you're gonna see a lot of that going forward. Chamber of Secrets starts pretty slow, not that there's anything inherently wrong with that. Destroying Ron's house for potion ingredients is a serviceable distraction to fill a level before the actual plot kicks off. However, doing the Quidditch bleachers thing again for the second level is pushing it a bit. Chamber then proceeds to kill time with potion making in the bathroom to make polyjuice potions to enter the Slytherin dorm. The first half of Chamber of Secrets is played out rather uneventfully. It finally turns around at the halfway point though. The Moaning Myrtle fight is another one where you launch stuff back at her, but the segment after in the Tom Riddle Memories makes up for it. It's objectively 2 long hallways that you solve some puzzles in, but just having a light visual atmosphere switch kinda carries it in memorability. After a rather generic section in the woods, the fight with Aragog, the giant spider, is rather cool. It uses a completely underutilized mechanic where enemies can be lifted with Leviosa and thrown as projectiles. In this case, fighting off Aragog with his own children before a kinda goofy car chase segment where you drive away from him as he chases you, which is basically this game's only vehicle segment and serves as a nice break from the action. Chamber of Secrets ends on an incredibly questionable boss fight. As cool as the Basilisk is, and it is, I have no idea how most of this battle works. I know shooting it makes it attempt to strike you and you need to bait it into smashing some boulders. I know you eventually need to make the strength potion, but Tom Riddle's ghost pushes you around when you try to grab the pieces until he decides he doesn't, and it all feels a little off. It's still a rather cool climax, especially putting the sword in the basilisk's mouth, but it feels like it's not quite working correctly. Prisoner of Azkaban offers a pretty large shift off the bat. For the most part, the game up to this point didn't have many enemies, just the spiders and bugs in the forest and a handful of bosses that were all kind of the same thing. But Azkaban has Dementors that make fairly frequent appearances from the start. They can only be defeated by using Patronus, which most adult characters have and are actually fairly aggressive, chasing the player down and grabbing them for a good amount of time. The first level on the train has a charming setting, although the camera disagrees and mostly serves to introduce the Dementors. Hogsmeade is another charmer. The Christmassy theming carries what is otherwise a pretty standard level that ends in a bizarre snowball fight boss against Malfoy. Yet another send projectiles back at the boss. The third level in the secret passage is the weakest of the bunch, stone corridors with potions to make that leads to an exterior area with potions to make. The next level begins with the extremely easy Whomping Willow boss before transitioning to the more typical puzzly stuff. The forest is kind of the same as the forest usually is, but ends with a big Dementor fight. And finally, it ends on a fairly cool level on Hogwarts' outer wall, which actually has a brief segment based around platforming, which very rarely comes up in this game. Plus a boss fight against the Mega Dementor, I guess, which is mostly just Harry fighting off the fodder Dementors while the other two do nothing, but is still a fairly cool ending, I guess. The Goblet of Fire, compared to the others, goes rather full tilt into action set pieces. It's the nature of the movie, as the Triwizard Cup, a wizard tournament, dominates the plot. The first level begins immediately with the Death Eater invasion of the Quidditch World Cup. Despite how it sounds and looks with the fire everywhere, this is actually a rather straightforward puzzle level without much combat. Just rescuing the characters you aren't playing as by solving simple puzzles, although it does end in a rather lame combat section, as it turns out jumping around and shooting wizard bullets at Death Eaters isn't all that exciting. The level after, where Harry and Hagrid visit the dragon cages, is pretty neat too. It's again more puzzle than action, but it has some neat ideas, with each dragon in a cage having a unique Leviosa puzzle to bypass it. The fight against the dragon is a pretty cool set piece as well, and basically the best level in the game to start the actual tournament. It's huge, follows you through the map, and shoots fire to both attack the player and interact with the level. It's rather exciting, and the first time the game has felt more platforming than anything else, and even ends in a full-blown little Crash Bandicoot-esque running towards the screen escape sequence. The mermaid sequence is a bit filler. Back in the bathroom for a third time and a few puzzles, although I suppose you gotta do something to hit 6. The underwater level is an interesting twist. It's the first time a true 2D section has popped up in the series since that crappy LEGO Batman bonus, and has free movement in the water. It's a bit sluggish and awkward, but the spells being free aim means it isn't too miserable, and it's a novel twist on the usual format, but not one that I wish to see too often. The Hedge Maze finale is really nice too. The maze itself is atmospheric and foggy despite being, LEGO, and it has some fun puzzles based around navigating it. It does end the game on a rather weak conclusion though, as the final battle and the first confrontation with series villain Voldemort is reduced to jumping around shooting Death Eaters and a quick time event. 2010 was a brutal time for bosses in video games. Beyond the many collectibles scattered throughout the game, there are also 11 bonus levels. Thankfully, many less than the prior game. 10 of these, like the prior game, are made in the level creator. Despite this, outside of the one that's a LEGO City level, they're a nice change of pace, much more focused on platforming and action while still having a more puzzle slant, which makes them feel pretty distinct from the main game and pretty fun to play through even if they're very simple. The final level, unfortunately, is LEGO City again. And despite being a bit of a mix on the LEGO City formula, featuring a real location in London as Voldemort and a generic Death Eater smash a bunch of trash cans, it's just not a very exciting final reward for getting everything, even if it's very, very funny that you play as the main villain on his way to murder the main character's parents. It's been quite a while since I'd seen any of these movies, so I figured I'd rewatch them here and talk about them real briefly. I think for the most part the game actually gets these plots down pretty well. I don't know if you'd fully understand what's going on without having seen the movies, because the first movie especially is just a lot of exposition about the world and characters, but I think you could kind of get by. You'd be missing a lot of information, but it's understandable. I have a fondness for the first two films especially. The later films get dark and edgy, depressing and dull. Sorcerer's Stone is incredibly charming. Christopher Columbus, best known for the Home Alone movies, is great at creating a sense of wonder and working with fantastic production designers. It's light and easy, and focused more on exploring and building the magical world through some incredibly charming practical effects work, even if the CGI is, basically every instance is aged like milk. Having the troll in the well-lit bathroom was ambitious, if nothing else. It's somewhat notable that this series is effectively isekai for fat white women. A loser dweeb is taken to another world where he's the best at magic, best at wizard sports, and everyone thinks he's really cool and kind, even the teachers. I don't think it's an intentional parallel, as at this time isekai wasn't as huge as it is now, nor was it very common in the West. But it is funny that it lands on so many tropes of the genre. The charm really carries this one. The actual plot is slow, but there's so much to see, and the final few set pieces, especially wizard chess, are very fun. The casting is also pretty impeccable. Daniel Radcliffe plays a perfectly dweeby Harry Potter, and Emma Watson is a perfectly obnoxious Rule Shark, while Draco is just the perfect little brat, although the adults are even stronger. Hagrid is the hulking gentle giant who really plays into his goofy aloofness. Quirrell is perfect as this stuttering mess of a man, and especially Richard Harris as Dumbledore, who in these early movies and books is much more of a gentle grandfather type figure, is played perfectly by his soft and charming voice. I'm not sure if he could have pulled off the darker aspects needed for the later films, although I would have loved to see it. Although when he unfortunately passed away, his replacement Michael Gambon was a perfect fit for the last few entries. And of course, there's Alan Rickman, who's the perfect Snape, basically carrying the whole series on his back for most of it. Delightfully unlikable, rude, weird, but also surprisingly soft at times. For a few other notes, the Dursleys, Harry's aunt and uncle, are so comically evil that it's actually a bit jarring and makes the opening half hour so very silly, even if I like the early parts especially. Voldemort in the form of Quirrell's scalp is on another level of impressively horrendous for CGI. The Sorting Hat is a terrifying prospect. Imagine on the first day of school a sex pest hat said that you'd either be a good guy or an evil racist at best, or doomed to be a background character at worst if you were thrown in the other two. And while the Quidditch scenes are well directed despite the CGI, I'd like to reiterate how horribly stupid the rules of the games are. It's obviously Rowling wasn't much for sports. Sorcerer's Stone is charming, simple, and easy to watch. An extremely nice kids movie with a fantastic score that's a pleasure to breeze through. Chamber of Secrets is interesting. Also directed by Columbus, the movie has to deal with a story that's a few notches darker, with Harry unraveling the mysteries around the Basilisk, a giant snake that lives in Hogwarts walls that has been attacking all the students, as well as delving into Voldemort's backstory. Despite this, the movie retains a lot of its visual lightness and whimsy, and actually makes the darker stuff more interesting by contrast. The movie is very often just as charming as the first, with a great opening scene as Ron picks Harry up in his flying car for the first day of classes, as well as many neat action scenes throughout, like a much more exciting Quidditch match where a cursed ball chases Harry throughout the game. Funnier characters are also introduced, primarily Dobby, the Malfoy's house elf, who punishes himself with beatings when he fails to help Harry, to Harry's shock and concern, and Gilderoy Lockhart, the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher and gigantic fraud who steals other wizards' stories for his own incredibly popular autobiographies, both of whom are crucial to the plot unfolding and keep the tone relatively light, despite the big finale being more tense than the previous one. CGI has taken an obviously huge leap here, with the parts where it's integrated still being fairly dated, but blending much better with the still fantastic production design, which this time includes a Titanic spider animatronic among other odd creatures and characters. While I still prefer the almost pure whimsy of the prior movie, I think Chamber of Secrets is still quite good. It holds up better visually, has stronger action when it comes up, and lets itself have fun and be fun despite attempting to tell a different kind of story. My only additional note on it is the scene where Lucius, Draco Malfoy's dad, attempts to kill Harry outside of Dumbledore's office over Dobby. It's extremely fucking funny. What was the next step of his master plan in this scenario where he murdered Harry Potter outside of Dumbledore's office? The Prisoner of Azkaban has a lot of interesting elements. Despite being notably darker than even Chamber of Secrets, centering on an escaped murderer who seems to be hunting Harry, it's balanced well with a lot of humor and levity, as well as just a, gentle touch. It cares about emotional stakes as much as it does about the action sequences. The story also is the first to not directly involve Voldemort. Instead, the primary villain is a tangential henchman of his, which is rather refreshing, and while CGI has largely replaced much of the fantastic production design, I think it's both extremely well put together to keep the style consistent, and interesting camera work and cinematography to keep up the momentum. It's not issue-free. Introducing time travel, even if its use is fairly interesting, is inherently universe-breaking, to such an obvious extent that it's mostly swept under the rug after this movie. Alfonso Cuarón took over directing here. You may know him from Gravity and the huge award sensation Roma, and he's perfectly suited to the material, although this was unfortunately his only film in the franchise. Michael Gambon also notably takes over for Dumbledore here. In this movie, he still plays it rather as it had been before, a mellow grandfather, and Dumbledore is rather absent in this movie anyway. The final shot of this movie is fairly notable too, for perhaps being the worst final shot ever put in a movie. CGI motion blurred Harry on his broom is such a hilarious final shot to end on, and looks so honestly terrible to the point I can't even imagine what they were going for. Prisoner of Azkaban, while not as easy or pleasant to watch as its predecessors, is still pretty good. Comfy, a little lower stakes while maintaining tension, fairly standalone. It's a very nice afternoon watch, and so far I've been pleasantly surprised on revisiting these movies, although I do feel as though this movie is the midway point of an unpleasant shift into being generic young adult novel about a brave hero teenager fighting oppressive adults. The Goblet of Fire is the nail in the coffin. There's elements I like here, but the movie definitely tips itself in favor of taking itself way too seriously. It forgets to have fun, explore the whimsy of its setting, or have a laugh. It's dark, moody, grim, and falls into, or more so establishes, so many generic young adult fiction tropes. A deadly tournament and the return of an ultimate evil that hangs over the rest of the series. People die, everyone, especially Dumbledore, is always yelling and angry. The color grading is gray and bland, the energy is high but the wonder is low. There's some cool action set pieces, especially the dragon, and that part is very fun. But so much of the movie is just kinda dour, annoying, and moody. Ron and Harry fight and yell at each other, then like 30 minutes later, Rowling got sick of writing that and it's resolved in like 4 seconds. Ralph Fiennes is great as Voldemort in kind of the same way that Ian McDiarmid is as Palpatine. Over the top, a little hammy, and having so much fun being evil that it's magnetic. I also like the background character turned secondary protagonist Cedric Diggory, played by Robert Pattinson, and the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, Mad-Eye Moody, an angry, crotchety old cyborg who injects at least a little bit of levity into this otherwise dreary movie. The death of the production design is a rough hit for me though. This movie does still have some of the elaborate and impressive sets, but it's very obvious that CGI hit levels where it could be consistently used throughout the movie, and they didn't hesitate to do so, even if it still looks fairly good. New one-time director Mike Newell, who you may know from the pretty decent Prince of Persia movie, does an okay job. You can kind of see him struggling to balance the action, heavier parts, and brief levity this movie needs. The movie climaxing with Voldemort's return is also a bit of an issue for me. The first 3 movies were relatively self-contained, even if they did have some overarching ties to Voldemort. But this new one jumps straight into a permanent shift for the series, centralizing itself on this big dark story with stakes that mostly strips the sense of lighthearted charm. While elements of Goblet of Fire work for me, I find it hard to care too much about it. It goes in a direction that sheds most of the charm that I really loved from the series in favor of what has become largely exhausting passé cliches and tropes of a genre thanks to Harry Potter's derivatives. The Hunger Games, Maze Runner, Percy Jackson, and so on. LEGO Harry Potter Years 1 through 4 is a nice change of pace for the series. While not my favorite, I appreciate its entirely different approach. LEGO Star Wars has always leaned hard into action platforming, while Indy leaned into puzzles between big set pieces, and Batman leaned even more towards action. But Harry Potter rather uniquely eschews both action and platforming for a more methodical puzzle and exploration style, while still squeezing a little action in where it can. It's kinda incredible that while mostly retaining the framework of prior games, not you Indy 2, the game can feel so vastly different, and its strong hub world makes that exploration feel satisfying despite some notable flaws. It does develop some sameness thanks to most characters playing pretty much the same, and the game is not very well polished to say the least. It serves as a nice proper step into the second era of LEGO games, shifting the series into a nice balance of the simple, linear levels from the original era, while managing to resolve most of Indy 2's issues and leverage them into a really successful overworld focus. With a fairly substantial amount of polish, it could be the strongest game yet, although its myriad of technical issues do a number on it.